She said goodbye to me on a Tuesday. Not a dramatic Tuesday, not a rainy Tuesday with thunder rolling in from the coast and lightning splitting the sky in half, like the universe was putting on a show for us. Just a Tuesday, cold, gray, the kind of day that doesn't bother to be anything at all. She stood in the doorway of my apartment, the one she'd never officially moved into, but had a drawer in, had a coffee mug in, had a permanent indent on the left side of my couch in, and she looked at me like she was memorizing me, like she was making sure she got every single detail right. And then she said, "This is the part where I have to let you go. Not I'm leaving, not we're done, not even I'm sorry. Just, this is the part." Like it was a script, like she'd rehearsed it, like she'd known for a long time that this scene was coming and had simply been waiting for her cue. I didn't say anything. I couldn't, because the worst part, the part that's lived in my chest like a splinter ever since, is that I understood. I understood every word she didn't say. I understood the weight behind her eyes and the way her jaw tightened, like she was physically restraining something inside herself from breaking. I understood, and I let her go. This is our story, told backwards, because that's the only way I know how to tell it anymore. Starting with the ending, working our way back to the beginning, back to before I knew who she really was, back to before she knew what I would cost her, back to the moment two women who had no business being in the same universe reached for the same thing at the same time. My name is Sophia, and this is the story of Alexis Sterling, the most dangerous woman in the city, and the 5 years she spent almost loving me. Let me tell you who Alexis Sterling is before I tell you who she was to me, because those are two very different things, and it matters that you understand both. Alexis Sterling is the head of the Sterling family, has been since she was 27 years old when her father had a stroke at a dinner table, surrounded by men who immediately started circling like sharks, and she walked into that room, sat down at the head of the table, and said, and I am quoting what her lieutenant Marco told me years later, she said, "Anyone who mistakes grief for weakness is welcome to test that theory. I have time tonight." No one tested it. She runs import and export officially. Unofficially, she runs about 40% of the city's underground economy, has relationships with 3 city council members, owns the building that houses the DA's favorite restaurant, and has never, not once in her entire career, been formally charged with anything. She is 6 feet tall in heels. She has dark eyes that don't give anything away unless she wants them to, and she almost never wants them to. She wears black like it's the only color that was ever invented. She tips exactly 23% at every restaurant she goes to, always in cash, always tucked under the edge of the plate rather than left out on top. I know that last detail because I watched her do it 17 times over 5 years, and I never once had the nerve to ask her, why 23? I know now. I know a lot of things now that I didn't know then. But on that Tuesday, on the Goodbye Tuesday, here is what I knew. I knew she was scared. Not of anything in the city, not of any rival or threat or consequence. She was scared of what staying would do to me. That's the thing about Alexis that nobody outside of a very small circle ever got to see. Underneath all that control, underneath all that power, underneath the woman who could end a business rivalry with a single phone call and once made a man cry simply by looking at him for too long, underneath all of that was someone who understood exactly how dangerous she was and had spent her entire adult life making sure the people she cared about were never in the line of fire. I had been in the line of fire for 5 years without knowing it. She'd made sure of that too. So when she stood in my doorway on that Tuesday and said, "This is the part where I have to let you go," what she was really saying was, "I love you too much to let what I am destroy what you are." And what I said, or didn't say, was, "I know." We stood there for 43 seconds. I counted. I don't know why I counted. Maybe because I knew it was the last time I'd get to stand that close to her, and I wanted to hold on to something measurable, something concrete, something I could carry with me when the door closed. 43 seconds. Then she nodded once, the way she did when something was decided, final, resolved, and she walked out. I stood in my doorway and I watched her get into the black car waiting at the curb, and I didn't move until the car turned the corner and she was completely gone. Then I closed the door, sat down on the floor right there in my entryway, and I didn't cry. I didn't cry because I wasn't sad. I was something much older and heavier than sad. I was a woman who had loved someone completely and had to figure out how to build an entire life with that love and know where to put it. There's a specific kind of argument you can only have with someone you love deeply and haven't said it to yet. It lives somewhere between honesty and self-destruction. It's too honest to be clean and too afraid to be complete. It's two people standing on opposite sides of a line that neither of them drew, yelling about everything except the actual thing. Alexis and I had that argument exactly once. 1 year before the Tuesday. It was a Thursday, late. We were in her penthouse, the one on the 42nd floor that looked out over the city like the city belonged to her, which, to be fair, large portions of it did. I had been there dozens of times by year 4. I had a key, technically, though I later found out the lock had been reconfigured to read my fingerprints specifically, not a key, because Alexis decided sometime in year 3 that keys could be copied and my fingerprint could not. She didn't tell me this until year 4, during the argument, when it came out like a confession she hadn't meant to make. We were arguing about a man named Danilo Reyes. He had moved into Alexis's territory and had been making increasingly aggressive moves. 2 of her warehouses vandalized. One of her business managers followed home 3 nights in a row. And one afternoon, in the parking garage of the gallery where I worked, a black car with no plates had driven slowly past my car. Twice. I told Alexis about the car. That was my mistake. Or maybe it wasn't a mistake. Maybe it was the first honest thing I'd done in 4 years, which is its own kind of devastation. Because the moment I told her, something in her face did what I had never seen it do before. It broke. Just for a second. A single fracture, there and gone, like a hairline crack in marble. But I saw it. And I think she knew I saw it. "You need to stay away from the gallery for a while," she said. Her voice was perfectly level. Too level. The kind of level that means the thing underneath is very much not level. "I work at the gallery," I said. "It's my job." "I'll cover your salary. Take it as a sabbatical." "Alexis." "Sophia." She said my name the way she said everything. Precisely. Like she'd selected it from a list of options and determined it was the most efficient choice. "This isn't a conversation. This is me telling you what needs to happen. And here's where 4 years of almost, but never quite, came out of my mouth in a way I hadn't planned. You don't get to tell me what needs to happen. You don't get to make decisions about my life and hand them to me like directives. You're not my... I stopped. She looked at me. We both knew what the next word was. We had both known what the next word was for approximately 3.5 years. It sat between us in that penthouse like a piece of furniture. Neither of us had ordered, but that kept showing up anyway. You're not my anything. That was what I was going to say. Except that wasn't true, and we both knew it wasn't true, and that was the whole problem. You're right, she said finally, quietly. I'm not. 2 words, perfectly chosen, devastatingly dishonest. And then, because Alexis Sterling has never once in her life left a room at the wrong moment, she said, "But you're mine." She didn't mean it the way it sounds, or maybe she did. To this day, I'm not completely sure. What I know is that she said it like it cost her something, like she had been holding it in a closed fist for years, and her hand had finally just opened, against her will, against every instinct she had. She crossed the room, stopped about 2 feet away from me. 2 feet is not very far. 2 feet is close enough to feel the warmth of someone, close enough to see that her hands were very, very still, because she was working extremely hard to keep them that way. "I need you to be safe," she said. "That's all I'm asking." "That's not all you're asking. You're asking me to stay small, to stay out of the way, to make myself invisible so that nobody notices you care about me." Something moved across her face. The specific guilt of someone who knows you've just said an accurate thing and cannot argue with it. "I care about everyone in my life, carefully," she said. "I know," I said. "That's exactly the problem." We stood there in all that space between 2 feet and a confession, and neither of us moved. And eventually I picked up my coat and I left. She let me leave. She always let me leave. That was year 4. I found out Alexis Sterling was in the hospital the same way I found out most things about her inner world. Accidentally, through a crack in the wall she'd built around herself that she hadn't noticed yet. Her Lieutenant Marco called me, not because Alexis had asked him to, because Marco had watched his boss sit in a hospital waiting room for 6 hours waiting for news on a wounded associate. And somewhere around hour 4, Alexis had picked up her phone, opened my contact, and then put it back down. 3 times. Marco, who has the emotional intelligence of someone who has watched his boss almost self-destruct in slow motion for years, made the executive decision to call me himself. "She won't ask," he said when I picked up, "so I'm asking for her." I was there in 20 minutes. She was sitting in the corner of the waiting room, in one of those plastic chairs that hospitals put in waiting rooms specifically, I think, to remind you that comfort is not something this place is designed to provide. She was in her work clothes, a black blazer, dark trousers, a silk shirt, and she had her hands folded in her lap, and she was staring at the middle distance with an expression I can only describe as contained. She looked up when I walked in. Something happened in her eyes. Not softness exactly. That word is too simple for what happened. It was more like relief that has been kept under pressure for a very long time, exhaling all at once. She said, "You didn't have to come." "I know," I said, and sat down next to her. Not across from her, not 2 seats away with a buffer, next to her. Close enough that our shoulders touched, just barely, just at the edge. We sat in silence for a long time. 40 minutes, maybe. At one point, and I want you to understand that this woman does not do this. At one point, her head dropped. Just slightly. Just enough that her temple rested against my shoulder. For approximately 4 seconds. Then she straightened back up, and she never mentioned it. But I felt it everywhere. I drove home that night, and I sat in my car in my parking garage for a long time. Not thinking, just holding it. That 4-second wait. That tiny, enormous thing she'd allowed herself. I think that was the night I stopped telling myself it was complicated. It was never complicated. It was always simple. It was just terrifying, which is a different thing. She was terrifying, not because of who she was in the city, not because of the sterling name or what it meant, or the particular way powerful people stepped out of her path when she walked into a room. She was terrifying because of that 4-second lean, because of the fingerprint lock, because of the fact that Marco had her phone in his hand and he called me, because every single thing she did that wasn't a word was louder than anything she could have said. She was terrifying because I was deeply, completely, quietly in love with her, and had been for a long time, and I didn't know what to do with that love inside the specific geography of who she was. There was a night in year 2 that I have replayed more times than I can count. It was late summer, one of those nights where the heat lingers past midnight and the city feels thick and close, like it's pressed up against the windows. We were on the rooftop terrace of a restaurant, the kind of place where the tables have candles in glass holders and the menu doesn't have prices, and somehow that's considered elegant rather than alarming. We went to dinner sometimes, Alexis and I, had been doing it for almost a year by that point. Every few weeks, no particular schedule, she would text me something like, Tuesday, 8 p.m., I'll send a car, and I would text back, okay, and that would be the entirety of the planning. I never asked where we were going. She always chose somewhere extraordinary. That night, we were talking about nothing important. That was the thing about our dinners. We talked about everything except the important things. Art, because I worked in a gallery and she had opinions. Architecture, books, the specific failure modes of people who had too much power too quickly. And somewhere between the second course and the third, she said something that made me laugh. Really laugh. The kind that sneaks up on you, the kind you don't have time to make elegant. She stopped talking and watched me laugh. And when I looked back at her, her expression was, I don't have a word for it. I've tried to find one for 3 years. The closest I can get is the face of someone realizing something they had maybe always known, but had successfully avoided knowing until this exact moment. She looked at me like I was something she had not expected, like I had surprised her simply by existing in the specific way I existed. And then she reached across the table. She reached across the table and her fingers touched mine. Not held, not grasped, just touched, rested, so lightly. The way you test the temperature of something before you commit. The world got very quiet. I looked down at her hand, and then I looked up at her face, and her eyes were dark and serious and completely unguarded, which, for Alexis Sterling, was the equivalent of another person throwing themselves across a table. And then her phone rang. She looked at the screen. Something shifted, not in her expression, she was too controlled for that, but in the quality of her stillness, like something had tightened. She pulled her hand back, slowly, deliberately. I have to take this, she said. I know, I said. She stood and walked to the far end of the terrace and answered the call. I sat at the table with the ghost of her fingers on mine and the candle between us, and I looked out at the city and I thought, if she comes back to this table and pretends that didn't happen, I will let her. And that might be the truest thing I know about how I feel about her. She came back to the table. She sat down, refilled her wine glass, asked me what I thought of a new exhibit opening at a gallery across town. I told her what I thought. She listened. We finished dinner. She pretended nothing had happened. I let her, and on the car ride home, when she walked me to my door the way she sometimes did, for reasons neither of us ever named, she paused on my doorstep, and she looked at me with that same unguarded look, just for a flash, just for a heartbeat. And then she said, "Good night, Sophia," and went back to the car. I stood on my doorstep for a long time, 2 steps forward, 1.5 steps back. That was year 2. The first time I met Alexis Sterling, I spilled coffee on her. Not metaphorically, not as an icebreaker. Literally. Hot coffee, white shirt. One of those spectacularly humiliating accidents that happens in slow motion while your brain is fully aware of what's occurring and is completely helpless to stop it. It was at an art auction, a charity event at the gallery where I worked. I was there in a professional capacity, which meant I was supposed to be composed and competent and definitely not colliding with the most expensive-looking woman in the room while carrying a full cup of coffee. She had her back to me when I turned the corner. I walked directly into her. The coffee went everywhere. I started apologizing before I'd even fully registered what had happened. A stream of, "I'm so sorry, let me get you something, I'm so sorry." And then I looked up and found her looking at me with an expression that was not anger. It was the precise opposite of anger. It was the expression of someone who has been in rooms full of people performing for them for so long that an accidental, genuine, mortifying human moment has become genuinely interesting. She looked at the coffee on her shirt, then at me, then at the coffee again. "Well," she said, "that's one way to introduce yourself." Her voice was low and dry, and somehow she made it sound like I'd done her a favor. I apologized again. She raised one hand, a gesture so subtle and so completely effective at ending a sentence that I stopped mid-word. "It's a shirt," she said. "What's your name?" "Sophia," I said. "What do you do here, Sophia?" I'm the associate curator. I'm so sorry about the—" "Stop apologizing," she said, not unkindly, just conclusively. "Tell me about the Harmon piece in the East Room, the one with the blue." And just like that, we were talking about art. For 45 minutes we stood in that gallery and talked about the Harmon piece and the artist's relationship to color theory, and whether emotional intent could be separated from technical execution. And she was the most interesting person I had ever spoken to. And the coffee on her shirt dried, and neither of us mentioned it again. At the end of the evening, she handed me a card, just a card, her name, a number. No "call me" or "it was lovely to meet you," or any of the social ceremony that usually wraps up a conversation like that. Just the card, placed in my hand, with her eyes on mine for exactly long enough to be intentional. Then she left. I stood holding the card, and a colleague appeared at my elbow and said, very casually, "You know who that is, right?" I didn't. They told me. I looked down at the card that said, "Alexis Sterling," in clean, simple type. And here is the thing I have never told anyone. I already knew I was going to call. Not because of the name. Before I knew any of that, before my colleagues said a single word, I already knew. Because of 45 minutes about the color blue. Because of 45 minutes about the color blue. Because of the way she'd said stop apologizing like she was returning something to me. Because of the card placed in my hand instead of offered, placed specifically like it was already mine. I called 3 days later. She answered on the second ring. I wondered when you'd call, she said. No hello. I took the weekend to think about it, I said. And I decided the color conversation wasn't finished. A pause. Then, so quietly I almost missed it. No, it isn't. That was year 1. That was the beginning. And now you know where we started. Now you know what we built over 5 years in almost touches and loaded silences and 43 seconds in a doorway. Now you know everything except the one thing I've been working up to this entire time. 6 months after the Tuesday, I got a package. No return address, just my name on the front, in handwriting I would recognize in my sleep. Inside was a book, a rare first edition of a collection of essays on color theory that we had talked about once, briefly, in passing, in year 2, in a conversation I had half forgotten. She had apparently not forgotten. And tucked inside the front cover on a small piece of paper was a number. 23. Just the number, nothing else. I stood in my kitchen holding that piece of paper for a long time. And then, because I had been sitting with an unanswered question for 5 years, and I was done sitting with unanswered things, I picked up my phone. She answered on the second ring. Again, always the second ring. 23, I said. No hello. A pause. Then a sound I had heard only a handful of times in 5 years, and treasured every single instance of. Alexis Sterling, almost laughing. My father tipped 23%, she said. Every restaurant, his entire life. He said 20% was what you gave when the service was adequate, and the extra 3% was what you gave because no service is ever just adequate if someone is genuinely trying. I sat down at my kitchen table. He sounds like someone worth knowing, I said. He was, she said. Silence. But a different kind of silence than we'd had before. Not the silence of things being held back. The silence of 2 people sitting in the same space, separated by distance. Together anyway. Why the book? I asked. Why now? Because I found it 8 months ago, she said. And I spent 2 months arguing with myself about whether sending it was wise. What made you decide to send it? A pause, and then, because Alexis Sterling had spent 5 years almost saying things, and I think she'd gotten tired of almost. Because I realized the only thing less wise than sending it was not sending it. I looked at the book on my kitchen table. At the number on the piece of paper. At the window where the late afternoon light was doing something warm and unassuming to the room. The color conversation still isn't finished, I said. A beat, the longest beat. Long enough for me to feel the weight of it, the full history of everything we'd almost done and almost said, loaded into a single moment. No, she said. Quietly, precisely, like she'd selected the word from a list and determined it was the only right one. It isn't. That's where I'm going to leave it. Not with a clean bow, not with everything resolved, with a phone call, with a book about color, with a number that means a man believed that trying deserves to be acknowledged. Because that's what a real slow burn is. It isn't fireworks. It isn't a grand gesture. It's two people who kept showing up for each other in every language except the direct one. And then, one day, finally, one of them sends a book, and the other one calls. If this story got to you, if Sophia and Alexis broke something loose in your chest in a way that felt familiar, I want to know. Drop a comment below telling me which moment was the one that did it for you. Was it the 43 seconds in the doorway? The 4-second lean? The restaurant almost? The coffee and the color theory? Tell me. I read every single one, and if you want to know what happens next, if you want a conversation that comes after that phone call, like this video and comment the word Sterling. And if we hit enough, I'm writing the next chapter. Subscribe if you haven't. Hit the bell so you don't miss it when it drops. And until next time, hold out for the person who has your fingerprint programmed into their front door and just hasn't told you yet. They exist, I promise.